Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Millions of people, including many children, have been taking part in demonstrations around the world demanding tougher action on climate change. Huge crowds gathered in cities in more than 150 countries, calling for governments and businesses to do more to save the planet. The teenage activist Greta Thunberg, who protested alone outside the Swedish parliament last year to draw attention to climate change, is tonight leading a march in New York. Our correspondent Sarah Campbell has the very latest.
What do we want? Climate justice! When do we want it? Now!
The Arctic could melt, many animals could go extinct, and everyone could die.
Stop climate change! Stop climate change!
My generation is terrified. Some of us are already thinking of not having children, of starting families.
When do we want change? When do we want it? Now!
Right now, we don't feel the difference. Doesn't mean there are other people in poverty and in third world countries that aren't feeling that difference. And it's up to us to put a stop to it.
Young and old took over the streets around Parliament in London and in towns and cities across the UK, marching in Glasgow and Aberystwyth, cycling in Nottingham, demonstrating in Belfast, Bristol and Birmingham. This was about children and young people mobilising adults into action.
I hope they'll listen to us and realise that we really need a change.
I've never been a protester before, but we have to act now, otherwise it's just too late.
We're very worried, especially for these guys, because it's them that are going to have to put up with the things that have been brought upon them.
Is this something that you should be taking kids out of school for?
It's only one day a year. We wouldn't do it if she was older or if she was doing exams.
All these people are protesting, like all the adults.
We want to help.
It's not just protest the adults that should protest, it's the kids, because it's actually our future anyway.
This is a global movement, with events starting in the Pacific and the flood-threatened islands of Vanuatu. In Australia, thousands took part in rallies and marches, as they did in South Africa, which has recently experienced severe droughts and flooding. Then on to Europe. This was Berlin earlier today. New York is where world leaders will come together on Monday for a UN-backed summit on climate change. Already there is the 16-year-old campaigner from Sweden who's become the voice of her generation.
If someone would have said to me when I sat outside the Swedish Parliament 1 year ago that what's happening today would be happening, then I would never have believed that. I mean, this is not only my voice, this is the voice of millions of people all around the world. But I think it is because we are young, and we are the ones who are going to have to live with this.
This was a day of passionate and peaceful protest, with young people leading the calls for urgent action to protect their futures. Sarah Campbell, BBC News, London.
Well, as you just heard, the protests come ahead of next week's UN Climate Change Summit in New York, where world leaders will discuss how best to address global warming. Here's our science editor, David Shortman.
A stark reminder of what the protests are all about. For these people on a Pacific island, it's a matter of life and death, of whether their country can actually survive in future. As the planet heats up, the seas rise. And for millions of people in low-lying communities, the threats are already extreme and they're set to become much worse. I saw for myself 2 weeks ago how the ice of Greenland is melting, adding to the level of the oceans. And scientists fear that more melting will follow. All the time, human activities keep adding to the problem. This is Indonesia right now. The fires are immense, like in the Amazon. And they release carbon dioxide into the air, and that makes the rise in temperatures even faster. The challenge is that the world is on a course towards dangerous levels of warming. The global average temperature has already risen by 1 degree Celsius over the last 150 years or so. And scientists say 1.5 degrees is the maximum safe level. Anything more risks a range of damaging impacts. but we're currently heading towards a 3-degree rise by the end of the century. And that's even if all the climate promises made by governments are kept. If nothing's done, some fear an increase of 4 degrees with potentially catastrophic results. So what can be done? Well, the UN wants more renewable energy, like wind turbines. Today, the British government approved hundreds more, and they'll cost far less than expected. In the same way, the price of solar power has fallen, and the UN is hoping the summit next week will see new promises to build more installations like this. But hard facts remain. Much of the world depends on coal, the dirtiest of the fossil fuels, and moving away from it is difficult. And leaders, including President Trump, support it. There'll be a struggle ahead. David Shukman, BBC News.
Well, our correspondent Nick Bryant is in New York for us this evening. Nick, you've been speaking to Greta Thunberg, who helped kick off this global movement of children refusing to go to school, going on strike to protest climate change. What does she make of everything that's happened today?
Greta Thunberg was woken by her father early this morning, and he told her, Greta, come and look at the television. It's massive. And she did just that, and she couldn't believe what she was seeing. She'd gone to bed last night. She realised there were big demonstrations in Australia, but she had no idea that it would be as massive as this. At a huge demonstration, Clive, here in New York as well. 1 million kids have been given permission today to skip school to come to this protest, and clearly many of them have. Question is, of course, will this massive climate change activism translate into climate change action? That big meeting of the UN on Monday, global leaders have been told, don't turn up with beautiful speeches, turn up with concrete plans. A message being sent as well to somebody who won't be there on Monday, the US President Donald Trump, who withdrew America from the Paris Accord. What we're seeing is extraordinary. That single voice of Greta Thunberg, amplified, amplified, amplified again, that multiplier effect that has gone around the planet.
OK, Nick, thank you for that. Nick Bryant there, live in New York.
What began as a protest by the Swedish teenager Greta Thunberg, who decided to skip school on Fridays to draw attention to the plight of the planet, has today been called the biggest mass demonstration in history. Millions of people have marched in the streets in 150 countries to protest about global warming. Many of the demonstrations have been led by young people inspired by Greta Thunberg. She's due to speak to protesters in New York shortly. Siobhan Kennedy, our correspondent in America, is there. Siobhan.
Well, Matt, greetings from New York. As you say, there are hundreds of protests going on all around the world today as young people, school children from Australia to Iceland come together to protest about what they're calling the crisis of their lifetime. Climate change, of course, and what they see is politicians' inability or unwillingness to do anything about it. The protest started here in Manhattan about an hour ago. It's the largest march, the central nervous system, if you like, of it, because it is led by one 16-year-old, Greta Thunberg, who incredibly just 1 year ago sat outside her parliament in Sweden alone and held a very simple plaque that said, "School strike for climate." Well, today she has single-handedly managed to galvanise millions of protesters all around the world. Here's what she told them earlier.
This could only be a fantasy. I would never have predicted or believed that this was going to happen someday, and so fast in only a few months.
Well, of course, all this is timed to coincide with the UN Climate Summit taking place here in New York next week, where world leaders will come together to discuss what more they can do urgently to curb those rising temperatures. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the US President Donald Trump has said he will not attend those climate talks. We know, after all, that he is a climate skeptic, to say the least. But one thing's for sure, the young people here say they will not give up. For more on the day's events around the world, let's go now to this report from our correspondent, Andy Davis.
On a hot September day, a warming planet dominates the agenda.
We are the generation that will save this planet.
One generation, the youngest, now leading others before it, demanding urgent action to curb carbon emissions, the so-called die-in stage to warn of what might happen otherwise. This was Bristol.
Yeah, it's our future, and if any of us choose to have children, we want them to live in a world with clean air and, you know, not be underwater or, you know, living with gas masks or whatever.
School children and students led the way, but many others joined in.
To demonstrate that older people are as concerned about these issues as younger people are.
The theme of a planet dangling by a thread didn't win universal approval.
I think they all ought to get back to school and learn, rather than mess about like this. This is inconvenient.
But on these streets today, such voices were drowned out.
What planet we live in is more important than a bit of traffic, you know. My daughter's future is a lot more important, and we've got not much time left to save the planet, and we need to act now, you know. We're all here to show the politicians and people that are in charge of this country that we care.
There are thousands here today, but hundreds of thousands, even millions, adding their voices elsewhere. And the scale of this global protest, especially the number of young people involved, gives you a clear indication of their growing sense of urgency when it comes to the issue of climate change. Some of the day's first global climate strike protests happened in Australia, where an estimated 300,000 gathered at more than 100 rallies. From Melbourne,
It seems that the only people standing on the wrong side of history on this issue is our government!
to Sydney.
This isn't a fringe movement, this isn't a greenie issue, this isn't a lefty issue, this is a human issue.
World leaders were vilified over their climate change credentials.
Climate action! Now!
In New Delhi and India, as elsewhere, Greta Thunberg, the Swedish teenager who inspired all this, was fated.
I don't think we can hope to have jobs or have a nice future when our existence on this earth is not guaranteed.
From India to Indonesia, the scale and reach of this protest surely unprecedented. This was the scene in Nairobi in Kenya.
Climate change is real and it's coming for us, and it doesn't matter who you are. Whether you are rich or poor, this thing is real.
They protested in Manila, in Bangkok.
We're skipping school because the teachers teach us how to work in the future. But if we don't do this, there'll be no future for us to work in.
And Hong Kong. Even in Kabul, in Afghanistan, they marched under the shadow of the gun. Their message, if war doesn't kill them, climate change will.
We are not sinking, we are fighting!
For those on the front line of rising sea levels in the Pacific Islands came some of the day's most poignant images. And in Germany and Berlin came the most shocking, the melting blocks of ice beneath the gallows, a striking symbol of protest. Europe's capital cities saw some of the biggest crowds take to the streets, echoing to calls for governments to address climate change with far greater urgency. Back in the UK, office workers joined students in the protest. 100,000 gathered in London, claimed organisers. One cabinet minister said he couldn't endorse children leaving school for this, but said their voices were being heard. The Labour leader called them an inspiration.
And to those who say that school students and college students should be in college today, I say thank you for being here, for teaching me and everybody else a lesson about the environment.
From Brighton to Belfast, Cambridge to Cardiff, the UK Student Climate Network claimed more than 200 events had been organised today to raise the alarm for the climate, they said. For world leaders heading to a UN climate summit next week, a hugely powerful message has been sent.
Well, earlier I spoke to the Energy Minister, Kwasi Kwarteng, and I began by asking him if the government should be more aggressive in its approach to climate change.
I think in terms of the legislation, we've legislated for a net zero carbon emissions target for 2050, and we're the first country, big country in the world. to have set that target. People are looking to the UK for leadership. In that vein, we've been asked to host the UN climate change talks next year in Glasgow. So there are successes.
But when you're still opening coal mines, you're extending Heathrow, you've axed subsidies to solar installations and onshore wind farms, for example. How radical is the government really being to meet that target? You could go much further.
I think we could go a bit further in things like the rollout of electric vehicles. We've said by 2040 we want all new cars to be electric vehicles. I think there's room perhaps to accelerate that.
So there's a trade-off, isn't there, between, you know, not wanting to damage the economy, but also looking after our planet?
Sure. You see, I don't see it in the way that you've done. You've said there's a trade-off. I think they can work together. I think the key phrase in this is clean growth. It's clean because we have renewables and we're not chucking out carbon into the atmosphere.
It's just having your cake and eating it, though, isn't it, to quote the Prime Minister?
But the interesting thing, if you actually look at the statistics of the last 30 years, since 1990, we've managed to reduce carbon emissions by 45%. That's nearly half. But in that time, the economy's grown by 2/3. So that shows, those facts show in themselves that you can have a strong economic growth policy and combine that with a very responsible approach to the environment.
But to get the radical change on the environment that people say is needed, people will feel it in the pocket.
Now, in the first instance, you're right, it can be costly. But what we've seen, certainly with offshore wind, is a massive fall in costs. It's incredible how the investment and the innovation has managed to reduce costs. So those costs have gone down something like 30% in 4 or 5 years.
What are you personally doing to reduce your carbon footprint to make your life greener?
Well, I haven't driven a car for many, many years. I try and
You've been driven, though, by a government car?
Occasionally, I use that. People will know that I use public transport a lot.
How did you get here today?
Well, today I was driven by a government car, and I think it was a hybrid vehicle. And we're trying to work, especially with Grant Shapps, the Secretary of State for Transport, to make sure that all government cars are either hybrid or EV. We're trying to lead the way on this.
Why didn't you walk here today or get the tube?
Well, I was actually in North London, about 20 miles away, and I was paying a visit to my mother, so it would have taken a very long time for me to walk into it.
Well, that's the problem, isn't it? If you're wanting people to get out of their cars, public transport isn't quick enough.
Well, public transport is good. I think it's something that, again, we can improve, and it's much more energy efficient in many ways than old-fashioned cars. So that's something that we're promoting, absolutely.
Do you admire Greta Thunberg for what she's done?
Look, she's a remarkable figure. I think she's done an extremely good work in terms of raising the profile of this issue.
So do you sympathise with kids skipping school?
No, I wouldn't. I'm a great believer in education. I think education, time spent at school, is absolutely crucial, not only for the country, but also for the individuals.
There's no good if the planet's going to burn when you grow up, is it?
I would never recommend anyone missing school. I don't think that's the right thing to do, but I'm very impressed by the energy and the enthusiasm the young people have shown on this subject.
We've been talking about the future of the planet. Let's talk about the future of the negotiations with the EU briefly. Judges decide next week on whether Boris Johnson's decision to prorogue Parliament was lawful or not. If they rule against the government, are we entering a whole new era here?
I think that there is a debate to be had about the role of the judiciary in politics, in constitutional matters. But I would say that our judges are absolutely impartial. They're expert. They will have learned decisions. And I think they will do that in a first-class and professional way.
So do you regret saying that many people believe judges are biased?
I don't regret saying anything. What I would say is that there is an important debate, which is happening already in this country, about the role of the judiciary in political, constitutional matters.
Do you think Boris Johnson lied to the Queen? Do you think he is a liar?
I don't think he lied to the Queen. I think the prorogation was absolutely justified. Let's see what the judges say next week.
Kwasi Kwarteng, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, earlier I spoke to the Green MP, Caroline Lucas, and Robert Colville, the director of the Centre for Policy Studies, about today's protests. And I began by asking Robert Colville why he was critical of the demands of the climate protesters.
The Climate Strike website leads you to a thing called the People's Demands, which is produced by this sort of umbrella group of left-wing sort of campaigning organisations from around the world. And what the demands are essentially is that we need to do all the things you'd expect. We need to sort of decarbonise within 10 years. But we need to sort of massively focus on climate change. But we also need to do this in kind of ways which don't involve any sort of free market solutions, any technological solutions, any modern agriculture. We need to sort of,
I guess they would say the end justifies the means. So
it's basically saying capitalism has caused this mess. The way to fix it is to eject capitalism.
And you don't like the idea of that? You think capitalism has a solution to this problem?
Yeah, I mean, I think more to the point, I think that if you tell people that the only way we can fix the planet is by making them poorer, then they're not going to want to fix the planet.
Today, raises awareness massively.
Yeah.
But are people serious about the kind of actions that are required to make this become a reality?
I think they're deadly serious about it, and it's just as well we all are, because if we're serious and listen to what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says, then we need to get to halving global climate emissions in the next 11 years. Now, that is an ambitious programme, but the good news is that there are ways of doing it. For example, a massive investment in public transport that is good for people as well. So this is not an agenda of telling people what they can't do.
But the kind of sacrifices being called for, I mean, they're in the DNA of your party. You're the Green MP. But, if you're from the Labour Party or the Tory Party or the Lib Dems or the SNP, you're asking people to make sacrifices. That probably means they're not going to get re-elected. Can any politician do that?
I want to challenge your framing of this being about sacrifice. If we shift to a greener, fairer economy, then we've got more public transport, we've got local, affordable food, we've got homes being properly insulated so people don't die in the 21st century from fuel poverty. This is an agenda that has a positive outcome.
But it also has some sacrifices, doesn't it? Less meat, less air travel.
People want to fly,
less cars, fewer cars.
regularly. If people want to fly every month, then yes, certainly they're not going to be doing that anymore. But something like a frequent flyer levy recognises the fact that 70% of the flights are taken by 15% of the people. So those 15% of the people who are flying a lot will have to fly less. But I don't think that is a massive sacrifice compared to the challenge of dealing with climate change.
Robert Culver.
The problem is we need to work with the grain of human nature. And the minute you start telling people that they can't have things, I think that's where the problem starts. I mean, Caroline is sort of denying this, but there is a strain of the green movement which is essentially saying, not just to people in a developed world, and I think it's really kind of horrible to say to people in a developing world, you can't have the level of prosperity we have.
Exactly
you
not
can't
what we're saying. That is so much not what we are saying. We are precisely saying that those of us in the richer countries have to be able to reduce our emissions far more than this government is even thinking of. Let me just finish my point. This means that we need to reduce our emissions far more than this government is even thinking about, precisely so that people in the poorer countries are able to develop. This is absolutely about social justice and equity.
And the single best way to mitigate the impact of climate change on a given country is to increase its GDP. It's having wealth is one of the key aspects, which enables you to
wealth, doesn't it? And if your model of wealth trickling down has been shown not to work, I want people to be able to genuinely take part in the prosperity of their country. But the idea that simply chasing GDP growth is the way that's going to do it has been shown patently to be wrong.
So China is, will soon overtake America as the world's richest economy. You've got something like 600, 700 million people in the middle class. They want to drive cars, they want to use air conditioning, they want to eat pork for, breakfast, lunch and dinner. How do you persuade them not to do so?
Well, China's such an interesting example because they are going leaps and bounds when it comes to renewable energy, not just from an environmental reason, but because of air pollution and so forth. So they are actually in the lead when it comes to providing renewable technologies.
But they burn a lot of coal, an awful lot of coal.
And they are shifting very, very quickly now to not burning coal, not least because their people are choking in the streets and the public pressure for that is changing. And, if we can drive economies through fueling them differently, but we can also redesign economies so that they are not based on chasing growth, which doesn't help the people at the bottom. It helps the richest get more rich, but it doesn't help people at the bottom.
But for that I say, obviously China is a rather different political system for us, and it's rather easier for the Chinese government to achieve to cascade down change than it is in countries like ours. But what I find really interesting is that we started out talking about how you cut emissions, and seamlessly and inevitably we've moved towards basically issues of wealth distribution, issues of issues of system change, not climate change, to use a slogan. It's explicitly about ending capitalism and rejecting the market.
Okay, we've run out of time. Got to leave it there. Robert Culver, Caroline Lucas, thanks very much.
It's hard to remember scenes like it ever in the world's greatest cities, all on the same day, streets packed with hundreds of thousands, all calling for political action on climate change. What started as a solitary act by a Swedish schoolgirl protesting in front of her parliament just 12 months ago has now grown into a global movement, galvanising not just the young who will inherit the problem, but those already living with it. Starting in Asia as the sun rose, followed by Melbourne, New Delhi, Kenya and Berlin, and tonight the protests continue across the United States, including on the doorstep of the UN, where world leaders will gather in 3 days' time to talk about the climate crisis. And it's a message surely almost impossible to ignore.
In London, they blocked the streets of Westminster. In Sydney, tens of thousands skipped school. In Kenya, they marched, knowing Africa's the continent perhaps most vulnerable to climate change. And even in Afghanistan, they came out, armed troops protecting the protesters.
What do we want? Climate justice! When do we want it? Now!
Millions of young people around the globe trying to send a message to those in power.
We just really need the government to immediately act. We need them to save our future.
At 13, Scarlett became the youngest person in the world to get an A-level in politics. Now she's 15 and disillusioned with politicians.
We spent £100 million on Brexit advertising, yet there's nothing to tell our adults about the climate crisis. People call us irresponsible for striking from school, but we can catch up on one day of schoolwork. We can't catch up on the damage done to the environment.
It's become impossible to ignore the global groundswell of voices warning of a climate crisis. But will politicians here in Westminster and around the world really listen? And more importantly, will all this spur them into taking action?
Thank you.
This politician says he's listening. The Labour leader aligning himself with the protesters.
Showing our determination to combat climate change, protect our environment and our planet.
What would Labour do to tackle the climate crisis?
Invest in green energy industries and also quite a lot of rewilding in agricultural policies, but also properly measure emissions, including aircraft and shipping.
But the government's already committed to cutting emissions by 2050. Isn't that enough?
No, it's not enough. We have to go further and faster than that.
Is that realistic?
Yes, it is.
Meanwhile, away from the crowds, the government insists it is paying attention too.
Of course we're listening to people. I think in terms of the legislation, we've legislated for a net zero carbon emissions target for 2050. And we're the first country, big country in the world to have set that target. People are looking to the UK for leadership.
On this historical day, thank you all so much for coming.
In New York, the poster girl of this global movement addressed the crowds, hoping to influence world leaders coming here for the UN Climate Change Summit next week. While in Germany, the government responded by announcing a €50 billion deal to help businesses and households reduce emissions. This is the next generation of politicians. They say they want policies now that will protect their futures. And they say it's an emergency. Rebecca Barry, News at 10.
Well, all across the UK, thousands of children, their parents and teachers joined the protests, a school strike by pupils about their future and the world their generation will inherit. Dan Rivers joined some of those who took the day off school to deliver a lesson they say cannot be ignored any longer.
On a day when the world's children were called to act, across the country they answered in astonishing numbers. This was the scene in Bristol as thousands swapped school for the streets. Dr. Grace Thompson and 5-year-old daughter Kitty started their preparations early. The enormity of the climate change crisis is almost overwhelming her.
I can't look my kids in the eye, really. As a mother of 3 children, 5, 2 and 7 months, if I didn't really realise the scale of the crisis, and since I've realised that, I'd do anything to save their lives, really.
This family, like so many others, deciding to cancel other plans and head into the city centre. And there they stood in protest at what's happening to the planet and demanded urgent action. Some teachers were here too, like Caris Greenwood with one of her pupils, Evie, both out of class for the day.
I would say this is education, and actually it's a really important thing that children know about this and what they can do about it.
We're here because we want to make the world better.
But by far the greatest demographic were teenagers, who will inherit the consequences of inaction.
We should be in school right now, but we're on the streets striking because we have no choice. If we don't strike, then the action's not going to happen fast enough.
This is one of more than 200 climate strikes around the country, uniting both young and old. And the central message at each and every one of them: the climate crisis demands action now. Around Britain, the young reiterated that point through sheer force of numbers. In Brighton, the march stretched for hundreds of metres along the seafront.
Thank you, Birmingham. It's so good to see so many of you here today.
This was Birmingham's Victoria Square this afternoon, where there were many more people than organisers expected. And this was Edinburgh, again packed streets with many children demanding change.
It makes me happy just to see how many people are doing this to save this planet.
The overwhelming mood across all the gatherings was peaceful but passionate. Tomorrow's voters signalling to today's politicians that they should be doing better. Dan Rivers, News at 10, Bristol.
Our science editor Tom Clark is here. He's been watching these protests throughout the day. I mean, they are staggering, aren't they, Tom? And we saw the German government respond very promptly. They'd obviously planned to announce a raft of measures. We've seen measures here announced too. Do you think they really mark a turning point?
I think it's impossible not to watch this global protest, led by children, for heaven's sake, and teenagers, and not think we've passed some kind of, turned some kind of corner. Ambitious announcement from the Germans, absolutely, especially given their economy is currently coal-powered, effectively, and our government has also made ambitious emissions targets. But they will mean nothing unless the policies to enact them are delivered. And we saw Kwasi Kwarteng speaking there earlier. He was criticised today, only today, by MPs for failing to have shown meaningful action towards a plan for storing carbon, for example, which would be essential towards getting us there. And given the timescales here, we have to start turning this great carbon-fueled planet around before it's too late. That actually has to happen really quite soon.
And we'll all be looking now to the climate summit kicking off at the UN on Monday. There'll be a whole host of world leaders there, especially from economies that aren't really getting to grips with this. Do you think we'll see anything radical emerge there? It seems as though the Secretary-General may have been trying to manage expectations a little ahead of this.
The summit in New York was actually set up by the UN a few years ago to try and galvanise political action. They realised that the big summits they were having every year to talk about the science, to discuss how policies, fairness towards other countries, how we share this carbon reduction burden, weren't delivering action fast enough. So New York is about trying to sort of galvanise political actions. You've got the right leaders in the room. So far, as we know, some of them aren't moving at all or moving fast enough. But I can't help thinking the backdrop that we've seen today of these thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people around the world on the streets, and these children can't surely help galvanise and focus their attention a little bit.
OK, Tom, thank you very much for waiting to see on Monday. And as those leaders gather in New York next week, we'll be examining the huge threat from the melting ice caps as part of our series, Earth on the Edge.
Now, raising the alarm for the climate in what may turn out to be the largest environmental demonstration in history. The global day of protest began in Australia and has seen school children and others take to the streets in British cities, including Manchester, Glasgow and London. The demonstrations come ahead of next week's UN Climate Action Summit in New York. The UN Secretary-General has told world leaders to bring plans, not speeches. Most nations who signed up to the 2015 Paris Climate Accord, the commitment to substantially reduce greenhouse gas emissions, are moving far too slowly. Signatories agreed to keep global temperature rises well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels and, if possible, within 1.5 degrees to avert the most devastating impact of climate change. 2 years ago, Donald Trump famously announced he was pulling the US out of the agreement. The world is currently predicted to be heading to a rise of 3 degrees by the end of the century. Today, the activist Greta Thunberg said, "We aren't afraid to become unpopular." That may be just as well. Difficult decisions lie ahead for political leaders across the world. Here's Gabriel Gatehouse.
Just tell me why you're here.
Because we want to save the planet!
That's well rehearsed. Why do you think the people in that building behind you don't seem to be doing that job for you?
They probably don't understand.
Who don't understand?
Boris Johnson.
What do you want to say to the people in that building?
We'll be left activists! You'll be left shit! And we also want to say, what do we want? Save the planet! What do we want it now? What do we want? Save the planet! What do we want it now?
Every child should be in school and they should be learning. They shouldn't be bunking off, and it's very irresponsible for people to encourage children to do so.
Kids, eh? They always think the grown-ups just don't get it. But now it looks like they're right. Today, that universal phenomenon manifested itself in a series of coordinated protests across the globe. From Australia to South Africa, from India to Greece, via Indonesia and many other countries, millions took to the streets. In London, outside Parliament, I met Akira, about to start university, and Orla, who took time out from school to be here.
I'm in my final year of A-levels and I can't miss any lessons. Every hour counts. But if we don't create change, there will be no point of me going to university. There won't be a point of me getting a high-earning job.
There's a lot going on in politics here right now that isn't focused on this issue. Do you feel hopeful that this government or future government will actually grapple with this?
All you can do is hope that your voice will actually be heard, because that's why you've elected them. If not, then it's literally an undemocratic country, and we hope that's not the way the future is going to be.
Given the existential nature of the threat, optimism is a striking feature of the climate movement. Perhaps that's because they feel the momentum is with them. A recent poll suggested that in Britain, concern about the environment is at an all-time high. Well, it's very clear what people here want. They want the government to take action on climate change. They want them to do it much faster than they're currently doing. But it seems like there's a huge disconnect between the people in this park and the people in that building.
Political systems are often short-termist, in the sense that they think about the upcoming election and they think about, should I be investing in something that is only later, that I will only reap the benefits of later. However, climate change is something that is no longer a question of the later, it's a question of the now.
But the way democracy works is that if a government inflicts economic pain on its citizens, they're then free to vote them out at the next election, and somebody else can come in who's not going to do that in the short term.
Which is why it's very interesting and very promising to see so many people out on the streets now exercising their democratic right, especially those who don't yet have a right to vote.
Another reason for optimism among the protesters, perhaps, is that many believe the problem can be solved with a set of economic and environmental policies known as the Green New Deal.
There's a lot of policies in play, but in summary what it is investing in new industries, which would bring a generation of new jobs that are clean, investing in homes so that they're not leaking energy into the sky and our energy bills are so high, into public transport.
Much of the policy work in this area comes from the left. System change, not climate change, is a popular slogan. But those who've been at this for many years now see, on the other end of the political spectrum, they're beginning to embrace the issue too.
I think they recognise they need to do something. I think they're still not actually doing what needs to be done. And so, for example, we've still got a government that is, supporting fossil fuels with vast subsidies, that is forcing fracking on communities up and down the country, that is planning to expand Heathrow Airport, that has no conception at all that our economic system needs to fundamentally change.
To be fair, earlier this year the UK did become the first major economy to commit in law to ending its contribution to global warming by the middle of the century. But many believe the target needs to be much more ambitious. Jeremy Corbyn, Gabriel Gatehouse from Newsnight. This government has committed itself to net zero emissions by 2050, but these people here are saying that's far too late. Would you commit Labour to doing it sooner than that?
Much sooner.
How soon?
I can't give you the exact date. I couldn't say within 3-5 years, but I think it can be much sooner than
Within the decade?
Listen, it's got to be sooner than that because the levels of global emissions are getting worse, global warming is getting worse, and the species and habitat loss is getting worse. So we also need trade policies that reflect that. And so cutting our own emissions also means measuring the emissions from goods that we import.
It was a solitary Swedish schoolgirl who propelled the climate to the front of the global agenda. Pressure is building on governments for collective and coordinated action. But will they? In an increasingly polarised world, the kids really are beginning to look like the grown-ups in the room.
Well, earlier I spoke to Christiana Figueres, the former Executive Secretary of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. She led the negotiations on the 2015 Paris Agreement. I asked her if she felt let down by the political leaders who signed up to it.
Do I feel let down? Well, let me take the case of the United States. I actually think it is a huge disadvantage for the United States, for the economy of the United States, that President Trump has decided that he will leave the Paris Agreement, which can only happen in November of next year. Because you see, the fact is that that vacuum in leadership that has been produced by the intent of the White House is quickly being occupied by other countries who totally understand that the products and services that are decarbonized are the products and services that are of growing demand. And if you don't believe that, ask the people on the streets. Because the people on the streets want decarbonized products and services, and particularly young people want to be working with companies that are actually aligned with the science. So the United States is sadly, at least in those states that are not continuing to decarbonize, they're leaving their competitive advantage. And those states that continue will, of course, be the states that provide the dovetailing for the United States to come back into the Paris Agreement once we have different political leadership.
Putting the US aside, even the happy, willing participants don't seem to be going as fast as they need to.
Absolutely true. The fact is there is no country that is going at the speed that we need. And one understands that decarbonization is complex, and we've never done it before, so we have to invent the policies and the incentives to put into place. But from the point of view of science, enough experimentation time. We have to move forward. And that is why I'm grateful that next Monday here at the United Nations, at the summit that is being called by the Secretary General, there are at least 50 countries that are going to be coming forward to say they are ready to start the process that they have to finish by next year, which is increasing their ambition, increasing their goal of decarbonizing.
The UK government has set a deadline of 2050 to achieve zero net emissions. Many climate change activists here want that to be brought forward to 2025. What do you think is broadly the right target?
Well, the sooner the better, obviously, because this is about cumulative emissions. And so the longer we stretch it, the worse it's going to be. So sooner is better. 2025, frankly, doesn't seem very realistic. So I am of the opinion that we should set realistic goals and then push ourselves. Stretch goals, definitely, and push ourselves. Yesterday, not a country, but one of the largest companies of the world, Amazon, set a groundbreaking target where they want to be at net zero by 2040. Honestly, 2040 seems to me like a very good deadline for us all to get into the discipline of decarbonizing our economies.
I wonder, do you worry that initiatives like the Green New Deal mean the left own the environment as an issue, and in these divided times that means it can never have the broad appeal that's needed if change really is going to happen?
Climate cannot be a divisive issue, and that is one thing that I truly admire in the UK, having lived in London myself for 2 years. I truly admire that the UK has really understood that this is not a partisan issue. This is not a divisive issue. You actually have both parties coming together in the UK to push for the decarbonization that they know that is good for them. Unfortunately, in the United States, it still is a partisan issue, which makes absolutely no sense because the common good is the common good. This is not ideology. This is not a belief. This is facts. This is science. And above all, this is economic prosperity. That's the piece that we haven't understood. We all continue to think that addressing climate change is a huge burden and that it's a big cost. And study after study after study has come out now in the past 4 to 5 years, and recently again, to say this is not a cost. This is the best investment we can make, and protection of our planet, protection of our natural resources is what is the basis for economic prosperity and certainly for inclusivity.
Cristina Figueres, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
And now I'm joined by Lola Farken from the UK Student Climate Network. She was at the protests in London today. Thanks for coming in after pounding those streets. Well, you heard what Cristina Figueres said. She's the person who negotiated the Paris Accord, and she says she thinks 2025 is an unrealistic ask to achieve zero net emissions. Would you agree with her?
Well, the UK Student Climate Network don't call for 2025 as a target.
It's Extinction Rebellion, isn't it?
Yeah, we call for 2030.
She thought 2040.
Yeah, we don't think that that's enough. We think that when it comes to the climate, when it comes to the most significant political issue of our generation, we need massive, radical changes which are going to happen in the next decade. We want a Green New Deal, we want educational reform, we want youth empowerment in our political environment, and we want to see that in the next 10 years. We don't want to see that pushed to 2040.
And some of those things you say are not really related to decarbonisation. They're related to a sort of radical agenda on lots of areas. And I wonder whether you don't think that perhaps you should decouple those things, because you're going to reach a broader audience and get broader support if you go laser-like on perhaps decarbonisation.
Well, we don't believe that it's right to decouple those issues. We think that when we look at the causes of climate change, it's caused by so many different factors, economic factors, social factors, which date back centuries. To try and divorce decarbonisation from those issues is not realistic. And we believe that when we bring it in this package, which is going to help ordinary people, of a Green New Deal...
But don't you just alienate quite a large proportion of the population who you need to appeal to get things moving?
Well, we don't believe that's true. We think that people want radical change. They look at business as usual and they say that's not enough, that's not working for us. And if you look at the millions of people across the world who are coming out and striking, they're saying enough is enough. We want something big and we want it now.
And that is impressive, but millions aren't. And you need to bring everyone with you. Do you think that a growth-based economy works in your way of seeing the future and what has to happen?
Well, I think the question of degrowth is a difficult one. But in terms of how we see our economy, we definitely believe that we need to diversify the metrics by which we measure economic progress and whether or not the economy is doing well. We believe that looking at just GDP as the sole metric of whether or not a country is doing well is completely unrealistic. It doesn't factor in climate, it doesn't factor in how the economy works for ordinary people.
And just a last question on personal sacrifices. We heard today people talking about, they're not going to have children. I wonder, will your generation make different kinds of sacrifices? What kind of personal sacrifices are you expecting people to make for your cause? I mean, is it about plastic coffee cups, or is it about not having children, or is it both?
Well, we think it's about actually neither. We think it's about coming out in the streets and calling for those with power to do something. We think it's the responsibility of those who have caused this crisis, the fossil fuel executives, the politicians who have done nothing, that they should be the ones who are taking action.
So young people can still fly, they can still drink plastic coffee cups?
Well, politicians need to make it...
from plastic coffee cups.
Politicians need to make it easier for ordinary people to, not fly. They need to be implementing free public transport. Just think about how many people's lives that's going to improve. And then people don't have to make these tough choices, which are, might be economically difficult for them.
Lola Farken, thank you so much for joining us. I'm afraid we've run out of time there.